and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. If you've muted your own line, please unmute your phone, as your lines were automatically muted when you joined today's call. After the presentation, we will conduct a question-and-answer session. To ask a question, please press *1. And today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the meeting over to Candace Maynard. Ma'am, you may begin.
Great. Welcome, and thank you for joining us as we kick off the third session in our four-session pilot of educational seminars designed to provide the content, tools, and resources necessary for public health professionals to address cancer as a public health problem. My name is Candace Maynard, and I'm with the National Cancer Institute's Office of Communications and Education. Today's seminar, Clinical Trials 101, will include an overview of the basics of clinical trials, including how they work, protections for participants, and factors related to participation. Please note that we have a variety of different skill levels in our audience today, and we intend for this material presented to be basic so as to lay the foundation for more advanced concepts to be presented in future sessions. It is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Ms. Sona Tucker. Sona is a public health advisor in the National Cancer Institute's Office of Communications and Education. Ms. Tucker is an experienced health communications and education professional working in the field for the past 14 years with the National Cancer Institute. Sona has particular interests and expertise in clinical trials education and recruitment, as well as materials and program development, dissemination, and promotion. She is a health educator by training and received her Master of Arts in Health Education in 1998 and her Bachelor of Science in Biology in 1992, both from the University of Maryland. I have just a few quick housekeeping items before I turn things over to our presenter. The archive for today's session will be posted to the Education and Training Tools for Health Professionals page located on cancer.gov next week. We invite your questions throughout today's presentation. You can pose questions live through the operator by pressing 1 on your phone. You will then be placed in the queue for the live Q&A session at the end of today's call. You can also submit questions via the Q&A tab at the top left of your screen. We will get to as many calls and questions as we can, and we'll alternate between online and live operator. And without further ado, today's presenter, Ms. Sona Tucker.
Great. Thank you, Candace. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be presenting Clinical Trials 101 to you today. In other words, we're going to talk about the basics about clinical trials. As Candace mentioned, and as most of you know, this Cancer Classroom series is geared toward public health professionals, health educators, and those newer to the field of oncology. As such, this particular session will provide a general overview of clinical trials. For those of you who are clinicians or clinical trialists, you may already know most of this information, but hopefully the webinar will serve as a good refresher to you. Also, this and the previous 2 webinars in this Cancer Classroom series are archived on our cancer.gov education and training page, so we hope you'll tell your colleagues about them so they can view them at their convenience. So let's get to it. Here are the objectives for today's webinar. The first objective will be to talk about what clinical trials are, review the types and phases of clinical trials, and how the drug development process works. Our second objective will be to discuss the protections that are in place for clinical trial participants and some of the regulatory aspects of clinical trials. Finally, our last objective will be to talk about some of the reasons so few people participate in research studies. And the next Cancer Classroom session in July, Clinical Trials 102, will go further in depth about clinical trials accrual and what the National Cancer Institute is doing to address this issue. So why should we learn about clinical trials? What is their importance, and why is it that we should care about this topic? Well, cancer affects all of us. We all know that, whether we have it, whether we care about someone who does, or worry about getting it in the future. The statistics are staggering. Last year in 2010 in the United States, more than 1.5 million people were diagnosed with cancer. That's more than 500,000 people died of cancer, and that's more than 1,500 people a day. It's the second most common cause of death, exceeded only by heart disease. And people of color are disproportionately affected by cancer. For instance, African Americans have the highest risk of any U.S. racial ethnic group of not only getting cancer, but also dying from it. It's important for us to understand what clinical trials do to fight cancer. They translate results of basic scientific research into better ways to prevent, diagnose, and treat cancer. They contribute to knowledge and progress against cancer. Many of today's most effective cancer treatments are based on previous study results. And the more people that participate in clinical trials, the faster we can answer those critical research questions that lead us to better treatment and prevention options for all cancers. So let's talk about the nuts and bolts of clinical trials and what they are. So clinical trials are simply research studies that are with people. They're the final step in a long research process that includes preliminary laboratory research and animal testing. If you think about the medicines of today, whether it's for cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or just for a simple headache, each of those went through the clinical trials process to be approved for use in people. Each study tries to answer scientific questions and find better ways to prevent, diagnose, or treat a cancer, or to improve overall care. In cancer research, a clinical trial is designed to show how a certain anti-cancer approach, such as a promising new drug, a new surgical procedure, or a new diagnostic test, affects people who receive it. So clinical trials are important in that they contribute to knowledge and progress against cancer, and that progress allows many people with cancer to live longer lives and have a better quality of life. Now, when we talk about clinical trials, there are 5 different types that we refer to. These follow what we call the cancer continuum, which spans prevention of cancer to the end-of-life care. The 5 types of trials are shown here. They're prevention trials, screening and early detection, diagnostic, treatment, and quality of life and supportive care. Often, people only think that clinical trials are for the treatment of cancer and that a participant has to be a cancer patient to join. That's not the case. Healthy people or people who are at increased risk for cancer can also participate in trials for the prevention or early detection of cancer. So let's talk about each of these types of trials one by one. Cancer prevention clinical trials are studies involving healthy people who are at increased risk for developing cancer. These studies try to answer specific questions about the effectiveness of ways to reduce the risk of cancer. These trials can be action-oriented, such as exercising more or quitting smoking, or agent-focused, such as taking a vitamin or a mineral or a certain medicine. Some cancer prevention trials are done in people who already had cancer, and they're trying to learn better ways to prevent a cancer from returning. One example of an agent study that you may have heard of is SELECT, the Selenium and Vitamin E Prostate Cancer Prevention Trial. This trial recruited 32,000 men to test the effectiveness of those 2 supplements, or agents, in reducing prostate cancer risk in men over 50. Now, placebos may be used in prevention trials when we don't yet have a known approach for cancer prevention. Placebos are treatments, which are often drugs, that are designed to look like the medicine being tested, but that don't actually contain any active ingredient. Participants are told if this is a possibility before they decide to take part in a trial. In all cancer clinical trials, there are risks and benefits involved, and we'll talk about some of those after discussing the types. Another type of trial is screening and early detection trials. Screening trials study ways to detect cancer earlier. They're often conducted to determine whether finding cancer before it causes symptoms decreases the chance of dying from the disease. These trials involve people who do not have any symptoms of cancer. One example of this type of trial is NLST, or the National Lung Screening Trial. You may have heard of this trial recently as well in the news as it came out with its results. It was launched in 2002 and compared 2 ways of detecting lung cancer: low-dose helical computed tomography, otherwise known as spiral CT, and standard chest X-ray for their effects on lung cancer death rates in a high-risk population. More than 53,000 current or former heavy smokers joined NLST at different sites across the country. In November 2010, NLST reported their results showing that there were 20% fewer lung cancer deaths among trial participants screened with spiral CT compared to those who got screened with chest X-rays. There are also diagnostic trials. These often get confused with screening trials, so when discussing these 2 different types, it's important to make a clear distinction between the 2. As I mentioned earlier, screening trials study ways to detect cancer earlier. Diagnostic trials study tests or procedures that could be used to identify cancer more accurately. They usually include people who do have signs or symptoms of cancer. There's great interest in the development of new diagnostic tools because they can help cancer patients and their physicians in the process of decision-making for cancer treatment. The trials can develop better tools for classifying types and stage of cancer and managing patient care. For example, a diagnostic trial might test a new method to better identify cervical cancer cells on a pap smear compared to the standard method of diagnosis. Another trial might compare traditional diagnostic techniques such as the CT scan with a PET scan or an MRI to see if they are as accurate as the CT or if they can provide new, valuable information to better diagnose the stage of a cancer. Most cancer clinical trials are treatment trials. These clinical trials involve people who have cancer. These studies try to answer specific questions about the effectiveness of a new treatment or new way of using a treatment that already exists, such as new approaches to surgery or radiation therapy or new combinations of treatments. It's also important to remember that placebos are almost never used in cancer treatment trials. They're only used when we don't yet have a known approach or a standard agent for a particular type of cancer. In some cases, a study may compare a standard treatment plus a new treatment to standard treatment plus a placebo. The final type of trial is the quality of life or supportive care clinical trial. These types of trials aim to improve the quality of life for people with cancer and their families. An example could be a trial that's testing a new method to better control nausea and vomiting for patients taking chemotherapy, or to test an improved drug delivery system to treat cancer pain. Making a decision about taking part in a clinical trial is a very personal one. This is a question that only the person with cancer or at high risk for cancer can make. Participating in a clinical trial has its risks and benefits. While a trial is a good choice for some people, they need to weigh the risks and benefits as they think about joining a trial. Some of the possible benefits of participation are that patients will receive the best standard treatment available. If the new treatment or intervention is proven to work, patients may be among the first to benefit. And they also have a chance to help others and improve cancer care in the future. Clinical trials also have risks. Some of the possible risks are that the new treatment or intervention under study may not always be better than or even as good as the standard care that's available. Even if a new treatment does have benefit, it may not work for every patient. Health insurance and managed care providers also don't always cover clinical trials. So now we'll discuss how clinical trials work. Integral to understanding how they work is an understanding of the drug development and approval process. Drug development has been changing over the past few years. The traditional process follows a series of steps where a promising substance might be tested in a laboratory, first in vitro, in other words, in a tissue culture dish, and then in vivo, in mice. Before a new drug or a biologic agent that shows promising results in the lab can be tested with people, the sponsor must submit an investigational new drug application to FDA, an IND. Once the application is approved, the sponsor can begin clinical trials with humans. If these trials demonstrate that the new drug is safe and better than the standard treatment, the sponsor can file a new drug application, an NDA, or a biologics license application, a BLA, to the FDA. Only after FDA approves the drug can it be marketed. Only 5% of applications for new oncology drugs that are submitted to FDA are actually successful. Some of the reasons for this low approval rate include long timelines for drug development, high costs, and the increasing complexity of clinical trials that involve molecularly targeted agents and advanced technologies. Now, instead of this long process, NCI investigators are facilitating testing of targeted therapies in patients earlier in the drug development process so that informed decisions to proceed with or to stop development can be made before an expensive drug is made in bulk. These studies will also take advantage of new advances in molecular imaging, which can help detect whether an agent being tested is reaching its target and having the desired effect. NCI's next program, Experimental Therapeutic Program, was created to address this. We'll talk a bit more about this, how this is done, when we get into the different phases of trials. Clinical trials can be sponsored by individual physicians at cancer centers and other medical institutions, by pharmaceutical or biotechnology companies, NCI, and almost any organization interested in improving cancer treatment, detection, and prevention. NCI not only sponsors a large number of clinical trials, but it funds an extensive clinical trials network to ensure that promising agents are tested. NCI has a number of programs designed to make clinical trials widely available in the U.S. Thousands of investigators at sites across the country participate in various aspects of NCI's clinical trials programs. Some of these include cancer centers, cooperative groups, community clinical oncology programs, NCI Community Cancer Centers program, and the Cancer Trials Support Unit. If you'd like to find out more information about these, you can search for them on our NCI's website, cancer.gov. Next, I'm going to review the phases of clinical trials. Phase 0 trials came onto the scene just about 5 years ago. They were brought about as a component of the next program that I mentioned earlier. Phase 0 trials can be conducted in less time with fewer patients than Phase 1 trials. By conducting a Phase 0 trial on a particular drug, the process for Phase 1 and 2 trials on that drug is accelerated. Additionally, because Phase 0 trials study how the body reacts to the drug and how the drug acts in the body, if a drug is found to react poorly or to have serious side effects, the testing for that drug can be stopped sooner without having the additional expense of further trials. There's also minimal risk to the participant as there are limited numbers and low doses of the drug that are given. A Phase 1 trial is the first step in testing a new cancer agent in humans. In these studies, researchers look for the best way to give people the new agent, for example, by pill or by injection, how often it should be given, and what the safest dose is. These studies also include special laboratory tests such as pharmacokinetics to evaluate how the new agent works in the body. People with cancer who are eligible for Phase 1 studies usually have no known effective treatment options, or they've already tried other treatment options. There are only usually about 15 to 30 participants in each trial. Phase 2 trials continue to test the safety of a new agent and begin to evaluate how well it works against a specific type of cancer. In general, people who take part in Phase 2 trials have been treated with chemotherapy, surgery, or radiation, but maybe the treatment hasn't been effective. Phase 2 cancer trials usually have less than 100 people. If a new agent has demonstrated in Phase 2 trials that's safe for people and effective for a specific cancer, it enters the Phase 3. Phase 3 trials focus on learning how a new treatment compares to the standard treatment, which is the most widely accepted treatment based on results of past research. Researchers want to learn whether the new treatment is better than, the same as, or worse than the standard treatment. Phase 3 trials usually have hundreds to thousands of participants in order to find out if true differences exist in between the two treatments being tested. Phase 4 trials take place after a drug is approved and is out on the market. The purpose of these trials is to further evaluate the effectiveness and its long-term safety. And these trials also have hundreds to thousands of people who participate. All clinical trials, regardless of the phase, follow a written plan of action known as the protocol. This document explains what will be done, how it will be done, and why each part of the study is necessary. Every trial has a person in charge, usually a doctor, who is called the protocol chair or the principal investigator. Phase 1 and 2 studies generally refer to that person as the principal investigator, where Phase 3 studies call them the protocol chair, under whose direction there are multiple principal investigators at different sites across the country. The protocol chair or the principal investigator prepares the plan for the study, which is the clinical trial protocol. Every doctor or research center that takes part in the trial uses the same protocol. It ensures that patients are treated identically no matter where they're receiving the treatment, and that information from all the participating centers, if there's more than one, can be combined and compared. With regard to clinical trial design, an endpoint is the measurable outcome that indicates whether the intervention is effective. Endpoints differ depending on the phase and type of trial. For instance, a treatment trial endpoint could be a tumor response or a participant survival. Quality of life or supportive care trial endpoints could include participants' welfare and control of symptoms. Randomization is the method used to prevent bias in research. A computer or a table of random numbers generates treatment assignments, and participants have an equal chance to be assigned to one of two or more groups, for example, the control group and the investigational group. Randomization ensures that all unknown factors do not influence the trial results. All Phase 3 and some Phase 2 trials include randomization. The goal of randomization is to produce comparable groups in terms of general participant characteristics, such as age or gender, and other key factors that affect the probable course the disease might take. In this way, the two groups are as similar as possible at the start of the study, and at the end of the study, if one group has a better outcome than the other, the investigators will be able to conclude that one intervention is better. When the analysis of a Phase 1, 2, or 3 trial is complete, the researchers will inform the medical community and the public of the study results. In most cases, the results of trials are presented at a scientific meeting, such as the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and then published in scientific or medical journals. Most medical journals have in place a process of peer review, in which experts critically review the report before it's published. In fact, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors now require that clinical trials be registered in a public trials registry such as clinicaltrials.gov. That means all investigators have to register their trials if they want their study published in one of those journals. This allows the medical community and the general public to learn specific information about each of the trial's results. In addition, particularly important results are likely to be featured by the print or electronic media and also widely discussed among patient advocacy groups. Once an intervention is proven safe and effective in a clinical trial, it may become the new standard of practice. So the development of better interventions is an ongoing, continuous process that builds on each other to improve the quality of cancer care available. So now hopefully you all have a fairly good understanding for what clinical trials are and how they work. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about how participants who take part in clinical trials are protected. Because of past abuses in patient protection, there are now strong safeguards to protect those who participate in research. In response to those prior tragedies, regulations and policies were developed to monitor trials and protect patients before, during, and after clinical trial participation. This ensures that people are told about the benefits, risks, and the purpose of research for which they're volunteering. Two similar sets of regulations enforced by HHS's Office of Human Research Protections and the Food and Drug Administration are in place to ensure the protection of clinical trial participants. If a trial is government-supported and it involves an FDA-regulated drug or device, then it is subject to both sets of regulations. Participants are also protected through scientific review of the clinical trial by the sponsoring organization. Clinical trials that are sponsored by NCI are reviewed through different types of panels, including experts who review the scientific and technical merit of the proposed research. Other clinical trial sponsors, such as pharmaceutical companies, also seek expert advice on the merits of their study. Institutional review boards are also charged with participant protection. An IRB functions as both a clearinghouse and a monitor of clinical trials. It determines whether the risks involved in the trial are reasonable with respect to the potential benefits, and it must approve any clinical trial before it begins. The IRB also monitors the ongoing process of the research. Federal regulations require that an IRB include at least 5 people from diverse occupations and backgrounds, and one of the members must be outside of the sponsoring institution. There are roughly 3,000 IRBs in the United States. Finally, participants are also protected by data and safety monitoring boards. NIH requires that all Phase 3 clinical trials undergo monitoring by a DSMB, and that all Phase 1 and Phase 2 clinical trials have a data and safety monitoring plan. The DSMB is an independent committee whose membership includes a statistician and a clinical expert in the area being studied. Other members are experts in different scientific disciplines that are needed to interpret the data and ensure participant safety. The objectives of data and safety monitoring boards are to ensure that the risks associated with participation are minimized to the extent possible, and to ensure the integrity of the data, and to stop a trial if safety concerns arise or if the objectives are met. Participants are also protected by the informed consent process. Informed consent as a legal, regulatory, and ethical concept is an integral part of research. In clinical trials, informed consent is the process of providing all the relevant information about the trial's purpose, the risks, benefits, and procedures to a potential participant who then, based on their own interests and circumstances, can make an informed decision about whether or not to participate. Participants have the right to learn everything that is involved in the trial, including all the details about the treatment and tests, and they can both hear and read the information in a language that they can understand. The informed consent form or document provides a summary of the clinical trial and explains the participant's rights. It is designed to begin the informed consent process. The participant acknowledges that he or she is entering a study, has been told what it involves, and understands the risks and benefits of participating. So let's now talk about who actually participates in trials and why some people don't participate. Approximately fewer than 5% of eligible people with cancer in the U.S. participate in clinical trials. This is far fewer than the number that's needed to answer the most pressing cancer questions quickly. In contrast, about 75 to 80% of children with cancer do participate in trials, and as a result, their survival rates are far better. Many groups choose not to participate. The elderly and minorities are underrepresented in cancer clinical trials. Although 61% of new cancer cases occur among the elderly, they comprise only 25% of participants in clinical trials. Also, not all people with cancer that want to take part in a clinical trial have a trial available to them or participate because it may not be geographically close. It may not be specific to their cancer stage and type, or they may be considered ineligible for other medical reasons. Why is it important to include women and minorities in clinical trials? There's an ethical importance to ensure that recruitment to clinical trials is conducted in a manner that is fair to women, to men, and persons of minority populations, so that no one group is unduly burdened and no one group is unduly benefiting. It wasn't until 1986, following the issuance of the report of the Public Health Service Task Force on Women's Health, that NIH established a policy to encourage women in clinical research. In 1987, the NIH Guide to Research added the policy to encourage the inclusion of minorities in clinical studies. In 1993, the NIH Revitalization Act entitled women and minorities as subjects in clinical research. But it wasn't until 1994 that the NIH revised its inclusion policy and finally mandated that women and minorities must be included in all of its clinical research studies. That was only 17 years ago. So what this means for investigators is if they don't plan or acknowledge this law in their research plans, they will not get federal research money to support their work. So why is it that less than 5% of the people with cancer take part in clinical trials? This could be due to several common barriers. Sometimes patients have a lack of awareness of trials. They don't know that they exist or where to find them. They don't have access as well. They may be far away, it may not be geographically close to them. Some patients may want to go on a trial, but they're not eligible due to strict eligibility criteria, such as not being able to be on because of a concurrent chronic illness. Some also have fear, distrust, or suspicion of research because of some of the past abuses. Many patients also have financial and personal concerns. They can't afford to participate. And some patients just don't want to go on and go against their doctor's wishes. If a physician does not advise the patient to go on a trial, they may decide not to. And it's not only due to patients that there's so few clinical trial participants. There could also be some barriers that are generated by a patient's physician. Physicians also may lack awareness of appropriate clinical trials for their patients. They may not know that they exist or where to find them. They may also be unwilling to lose control of a person's care. Most doctors feel that the relationship that they have with their patients is very important, and they want what's best for the patient. And if the person has to be referred elsewhere to participate in a trial, doctors feel that they may lose control of that person's care. Many physicians may believe that standard therapy is best. Some believe that the treatment in clinical trials is not as good as the standard treatment that's available. And finally, some may be concerned that clinical trials add undue administrative burden. The length and the details of most research protocols may deter providers from participating in clinical trials. So we went over the basics of clinical trials, why they're important and how they work, and why many people may or may not participate. I would now like to mention a little bit about some of our clinical trials resources at the NCI. We have a lot of information on this topic if you're interested in learning more. You can access our clinical trials portal on our website at cancer.gov/clinicaltrials. On the website, you can search for clinical trials for a particular cancer, find out results of recent studies, access our educational materials, learn about major NCI-supported clinical trials, or if you're an oncology professional, you can also learn how you can conduct clinical trials. You can also garner this information by calling our Cancer Information Service at 1-800-4CANCER, where information specialists can assist you with the information that you're looking for. In addition, we have many print publications for patients and a DVD that provides educational information about clinical trials. We also have information for physicians and other clinical trial professionals, including an online course that addresses how to include clinical trials in your practice if you're considering conducting them. You can access these on our website and either download publications and print them yourself or order them online in our warehouse. So that concludes today's webinar. I hope this overview served as a good introduction to clinical trials for those who it's new to, and as a good refresher for those who work in clinical trials day to day. I want to thank you for your time in listening today, and I'll pass it over to Candace so we can begin the question and answer session.
Great. Thank you, Sona. The second half of this call will be devoted to your questions, and we encourage you all to be active participants. In addition to having Sona available to answer any questions you may have, we also have with us today Ms. Linda Perico with NCI's Office of Communications and Education. Linda is a registered nurse with over 25 years of experience in oncology. Linda will be moderating our Q&A session today and answering any questions along with Sona. As a reminder, please press *1 to be placed in the queue to ask your question, or if you would prefer, you can also submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the top of your screen.
We do have a question coming in the queue. One moment, please.
Thanks.
As a reminder, please record your name when prompted. Bear with me for just a moment. We have two people in queue that did not record their name.
Actually, operator, we've got one question that came in by email already, so while you're processing the two callers, I'll go ahead with this email question. And the question is about, in Sona's talk, she mentioned that one of the barriers for people in participating on clinical trials may be a financial concern, that maybe the patient can't afford to participate, and the question is how would somebody find out if the trial has funding or if they would have a financial burden. And so that issue goes to the fact that some insurance carriers
So there's actually, let me back up, there's a couple levels. So people that are uninsured, have that issue of concern to start with. And in a cancer clinical trial, when there's an experimental agent being given, that agent is usually provided free of charge by the sponsor. And anything in that clinical trial that's considered experimental therapy would be covered by the sponsor. And so that charge isn't passed on to the treating organization or to the patient via their insurance company. However, standard care, they're termed standard care charges. So those would be the types of expenses that are incurred by a patient just by virtue of having cancer. So for example, a routine scan to measure the status of the tumor, those kinds of things. So when we look at a clinical trial, there's charges that are considered experimental charges, and there's charges considered to be standard of care charges. And the problem comes in that some patients' insurance policies refuse to cover standard care charges if somebody's registered in a clinical trial. So what's required, and it's more work on the part of the patient, is to really understand the benefits that are allowed to them through their insurance policy. And organizations are frequently really good at helping advocate with the patient and their insurance company to try to get coverage. Further, there's a number of states that have mandated coverage for people in clinical trials as well as for the standard of care treatments. And further, in the Healthcare Reform Act, there's a piece in there that's going to require that clinical trial charges are covered for patients. So we're hopeful that that's going to remove some of the financial barriers and worries for patients to be able to participate. Hope that answers your question. Operator, do you have the first caller ready? If not, I've got another email question I'll just go ahead with. This is from Samantha, asking, are patients able to request to review the protocol for a trial that they're considering? Certainly, I think that's a reasonable request that anybody could ask as a physician. When patients are presented a clinical trial, so the protocol document itself is usually pretty voluminous. And the informed consent, one of the purposes of the informed consent is to really outline for the patient exactly what that protocol treatment is going to entail. So usually the protocol consent form is a fairly lengthy document in and of itself and includes a fair amount of detail. But I think certainly a patient that would want to look at the protocol could certainly, ask that of their care providers.
And Candace, sorry, I do have a question ready for you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, Natalie Baptiste, your line is open.
Thank you. This presentation was so thorough and very clear. The only portion that I couldn't fully understand was the difference between phase 0 and phase 1 trials.
Sure. So phase 0 trials are something that's relatively new. They have fewer participants in these trials, and what they're trying to do is test molecularly targeted agents before they start with a phase 1, which is a lot more participants and at a greater expense of creating the drugs that are being tested. So these are actually, by conducting a phase 0 trial, the process gets accelerated quicker. And if a drug is found to react, poorly with a particular, with that group of patients, they can stop everything sooner so that the trials don't go to a phase 1. Does that help? There's also a minimal risk to the participant. There are lower doses that are given and fewer numbers of the doses that are given to patients as well. So it's almost like a precursor to a phase 1.
Okay, so the main difference is just a higher dosage and more people would participate in a phase 1.
In a phase 1, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay. We'll take the next email question, which asks, are investigators allowed to post any of your sites and or documents for patient subject education? Thank you for asking that question. Yes, all the information that Sona showed you from the cancer.gov website is our public site, and that information is there specifically for healthcare providers to share with their patients. So it's got great information on it. We really encourage people to use that information and to share it with patients, and it can all be reproduced. Thank you for asking that question. Operator, should we take the next telephone question?
Sure, we do have one more in queue. Carolyn Kolaski, let me open your line.
Donna, this is Carolyn, and my question is about accruing minorities to cancer trials. You mentioned about some of the abuses, the past abuses, and unfortunately people have long memories, and those memories, those incidences get passed down through the generations. What language do you suggest using other than words like research, which scares people and makes them think of experiment, research and trial? We have pretty, it's kind of tough to get people to participate whenever certain words trigger these thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. And that's been an issue that has concerned many people in the research field for a number of years now, because it's important to invite minority participants in clinical trials. It's important to understand what their fears and what their concerns might be. And so one of the best ways to approach that situation is coming from a place of awareness for the healthcare provider team to be aware of how important it is to not dwell on our preconceived notions about whether or not that patient may be willing to participate, because what we know from the literature is that many times African American patients are just as willing to participate as non-Black patients, but they're asked less frequently. And so if we make preconceptions about people's willingness, we're doing them a disservice. And then in that conversation with the patient considering a clinical trial, it's really important to take the time to ask questions and to really understand that person, understand if they know of any, do you know other people that have had cancer? Do you know of people that have participated in clinical trials? What do you already know about clinical trials, and what are your concerns and what are your fears? And a lot of times, taking that time to really let the person speak and tell their story and make sure that we understand where they're coming from, then really allows for an open dialogue to take place and to be able to correct any misconceptions, to be able to continue that conversation with the patient and to understand. And also knowing that a clinical trial legitimately may not be the choice for every person, because as Sona was saying, each individual has to weigh the risks and benefits. But I think for healthcare providers, our responsibility is to ensure that we really understand what's influencing that person's decision, the role that they want to play in the decision process, and to ensure that we're communicating with them in a way that's effective and works for them. I hope that answered your question. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question here from Gloria that came in by email, and her question is, do participants know whether they've been assigned to the treatment or control groups once the trials are underway? That's a great question. Usually, most typically, it's a phase 3 trial that's randomized. And patients, as part of the informed consent process, are told, you might be randomized to treatment arm A or treatment arm B or treatment arm C. Certainly, if there's a placebo or standard therapy involved in that randomization, and in a phase 3 trial, if we know of an effective standard therapy, that would be one of the arms, and people would be aware of that. So, once the randomization is made, then the patient is told, you are randomized to treatment arm B, which is, standard therapy, or it's, the experimental therapy. So patients would be fully aware of that. There are, I have to say, some earlier phase trials, like if sometimes in a phase 1 trial maybe, but more likely in a phase 2 trial where you're testing a new agent and there is no standard therapy. So say, for example, in a chemoprevention study, the person might be randomized to an agent versus placebo. And sometimes the situation is it's a double-blinded study where neither the investigator or the patient is going to know which one they're on. So that's, and as you can imagine in the informed consent process, that's a particular, situation that has to be explained, and the patient needs to understand that. Any more phone questions?
No, we have no other questions in queue.
Okay. We have another one here on the email. This is from Kathy. You'd mentioned when answering the first question regarding financial barriers that experimental costs are not passed on to patients. I understand that the cost of the agents may be covered, but what about tubing and administration costs? Is there funding for those costs if the patient's insurance does not cover those? That's a great question. And I have to say, I'm not sure. It's pretty specific because, when chemotherapy is being administered, there's a number of different charges involved, as you're mentioning, like the tubing, the administration fees, there's other fees, and I think that's usually a situation that's negotiated when the clinical trial is started, like designating which are experimental costs and which are standard costs and which would be covered. So that may be, a bit of a trial-specific question. And let's see. I'm looking here for any additional email questions. This one is from Carol. It was stated diagnostic was one of the type of clinical trials with cervical cancer given as an example. Would an example of this clinical trial be testing different types of pap smears? If yes, how safe is this to a patient, a non-traditional test for finding cervical cancer? What happens if this procedure isn't the best? Thanks. Great job with the presentation. So that's a great question. So, when you're looking at testing something new, what you have to be able to know in your clinical trial is that you're not, that the patient has to be offered the opportunity to have the current best standard of care. So it wouldn't be an ethical thing to be able to propose a clinical trial concept that would be testing something new, but if we knew that there was something already effective like a pap smear, you couldn't withhold what's known to be effective for patients. Okay. And just checking to see if we have any more. We have a question, again, about funding for clinical trials. Please clarify the question of funding for treatment under clinical trials. I seem to be hearing that some costs are covered. However, Medicare HMOs in Florida have refused to pay for treatment under clinical trials. So I think, different states have different requirements. So, sometimes it differs from state by state, but the things that you typically hear about, people talking about, are coverage for standard of care therapies that are part of a clinical trial. And I think we've come to the end of our email questions.
Operator, do we have any more questions on the line?
No, no other questions queued up.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again, everyone, for participating in today's seminar. Your feedback is important to us, and we encourage you to complete the public comment. The feedback from these pilot sessions will determine whether NCI moves forward offering additional sessions of CancerClassroom. The link to the public comment, which you see here, will be emailed to you following the call today. We hope you will join us again on July 26th for our final session in our 4-seminar session pilot from 2 to 3:30 Eastern Time as we present Clinical Trials 102, which will build on the topics and material that Sona presented today. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
The call has ended. Please disconnect.